On November 16, 2009, Kay Mortensen walked in the front door of his second home in Payson, Utah, a small city south of Salt Lake City. Most of the time, he and his wife Darla lived about 250 miles away, but Kay had a lot of valuable stuff in the Payson house, including at least 100 guns and rifles, and so he liked to check in on the property at least once a month. Kay was riding high these days. At 70 years old, he liked to say that he had finally found the love of his life in Darla. They had each raised separate families before finding each other 3 years earlier through the Mormon church, and now they work together as volunteer tour guides at a Mormon historic site, which was perfect for Kay, who was a retired Brigham Young University professor. This job allowed him to indulge his love for teaching and his love for Darla all at the same time. That day, Darla was heading out to babysit her granddaughters in Salt Lake City, so she'd be gone for hours, leaving Kay to do chores around the property all by himself. Now, the house was out in the country, kind of isolated and surrounded by woods, but Darla never worried about her husband when he was left alone at the house, because her husband, Kay, was not your typical retired professor. The man was a black belt in karate who always carried a gun and kept weapons in virtually every room of the house. Darla almost felt sorry for anyone who tried to tangle with Kay. Once, Kay shot a neighbor's Great Dane dog that he just said was threatening him, so he was obviously ready to pull the trigger. Darla kissed Kay goodbye, walked outside to her car, and then drove off to spend time with her grandkids. And once Darla was gone, Kay immediately stepped outside to inspect his pride and joy. Not many people knew about his pride and joy, but he had built an underground bomb shelter near the house where his family could take refuge when the inevitable nuclear war that he was so scared of finally began. Kay had constructed the shelter to very high professional standards, including an air filtration system and enough concrete to withstand a missile blast. There was even a bathroom and a composting toilet. Kay bent down and grabbed the handle of a heavy metal door that was sitting in the ground, and he opened it up, revealing a staircase. And then he went down those stairs and through another door, where he entered into the pitch-black shelter. Kay flipped on the lights and looked with satisfaction at the contents of his hideaway. There were canned foods and bottled water stacked to the ceiling. There was a small library of classic books and magazines, and there were 20 guns with ample ammunition. When Kay flipped another switch, he heard the electric hum of the air system kicking in. Everything was the way it should be. Kay knew that some people thought he was totally a crazy extremist whenever he talked about his belief that the United States was destined to be destroyed by nuclear war with the Russians or civil war right at home. But he was in good company in Utah. When he had taken a course in disaster preparedness a few years earlier, he was surrounded by familiar faces from the area, including Martin Bond, the son of one of Kay's closest friends. They had joked that Utah might be more ready for nuclear catastrophe than anywhere else in the world. And Kay had already made a fortune by predicting America's doom. He was so sure that the US dollar would soon become worthless that he had begun investing in gold as a young man. And sure enough, the price of gold had skyrocketed over the decades, and so now Kay was a multimillionaire. It was a good thing he'd made all that money, Kay thought as he walked back to the house from his bomb shelter. His oldest child, Roger, who lived just down the road in Payson, was constantly in need of money for one thing or another. Kay loved Roger, but his son, despite being 48 years old, really couldn't take care of himself, not since he suffered a severe head injury from driving his ATV off a cliff in 1994. Ever since then, Roger had not been able to hold a steady job for very long. Kay had already put his wealth into a trust that would be divided among his 3 kids, but he knew that Roger would continue to cost him money for the rest of his days. Despite Kay's misgivings about his son, he was looking forward to seeing Roger and his wife Pam that evening. Pam had called the night before to suggest they drop by to play board games before Kay and Darla went back to their primary home 250 miles away. The couple might be needy, Kay thought, but they were loyal. They never missed a chance to see him while he was in town. But first, Kay had chores to do that would take most of the day, including getting the house ready for another snowy Utah winter. Also, the internet service was acting kind of shaky, and so he had called a tech to come take a look. So when he heard a car pulling up the driveway around 4, he thought it might be the tech guy. And when the doorbell rang, Kay opened the door without giving it a second thought. Around 5:30 p.m., so less than an hour later, Kay's son, Roger, and daughter-in-law, Pam, pulled into Kay's driveway, and they could see that Kay had company. A blue hatchback car that they didn't recognize was sitting in front of the house. Pam figured it was a handyman helping Kay with his internet problems, or maybe replacing a worn-out carpet that Darla hated. Pam rang the doorbell with a smile on her face and a pecan pie in her hand, Kay's favorite. A friend at work had given Pam the pie as a gift that morning, and all day she couldn't wait to give it to Kay. But when the door opened, it was not Kay. Instead, a man in his 20s with a blank look on his face greeted them and let them inside, saying, "Don't worry, Kay was right upstairs." Two hours later, at about 7:45 p.m., a very strange 911 call came into the county sheriff's office that patrolled Payson. When the dispatcher answered, a woman with a calm voice told her that she and her husband had just been held hostage for the last 2 hours by gunmen inside of her father-in-law's house, and now the gunmen were gone, and so they were calling the police. The caller was, of course, Pam Mortensen. But when the dispatcher asked Pam for more details, Pam couldn't seem to remember a thing. She said there could have been maybe 3 gunmen, but she wasn't sure, and then when asked what any of them looked like, she said she didn't really get a good look, but they could have been African American. Meanwhile, in the background of this call from Pam, her husband, Roger, so Kay's son, yelled out a different account. He said there were 2 invaders, and they both were white. While Pam continued talking to the dispatcher, Roger yelled out that he was going to go check on his father, who was upstairs. And so Roger ran upstairs, and then moments later, Roger came back downstairs, and while Pam was still on the 911 call, Roger would say out loud that his father was dead. The dispatcher, who heard this, said that sheriff's deputies were on their way. A few minutes later, around 8 p.m., Kay's wife, Darla, who was driving home from her day with her grandchildren, got a call from her neighbor. Her neighbor was usually a laid-back person, but now he sounded totally anxious. He told Darla that there were all kinds of sheriff's deputies at her house in Payson. The friend had no idea what it was about, but he urged Darla to be careful when she went home. Darla hung up and had a horrible thought. What if Kay shot someone? He'd always said he'd kill anyone who tried to break into their house. Maybe it actually happened. Darla then repeatedly began calling Kay's cell phone, but he didn't pick up. And so in a panic, she called a friend and explained what was going on, and the 2 women agreed to meet near Darla's home in Payson at 8:30, and they would find out what was going on together. By 8:30 p.m. that night, yellow police tape blocked access to the driveway at Kay and Darla's house, and police cruisers lined the rural road leading up to it. Even the leader of the investigation, Sergeant Eric Knutson of the Utah County Sheriff's Office, had to park a 10 minutes walk away from the crime scene. But as soon as Knutson arrived at the house, a sheriff's deputy led him through the growing scrum of investigators into the house to the upstairs bathroom. And there, in the bathroom, was the body of Kay Mortensen. He was kneeling on the tile, bent half over his bathtub. His hands and feet were zip-tied together. As Knutson got closer, he could see that Kay's throat had been repeatedly slashed from ear to ear, and he had a deep stab wound in the back of his neck. Whoever had done this had first arranged Kay over the bathtub so that his blood didn't get all over the floor. It was almost like an execution. Knutson was a veteran detective who had seen lots of grisly crime scenes before, but the cruelty of what he was seeing in front of him made him a little bit nauseous. It also puzzled him. Kay was well known for his self-defense skills and his vow to defend his home with deadly force if necessary. How could this have happened? Downstairs in the living room, sheriff's deputies were trying to get more details from Kay's son, Roger, and his wife, Pam, the 2 who had called 911, but it was frustrating work. The couple repeatedly contradicted each other as they tried to describe what happened, or they would just shrug nonchalantly and say they didn't know the answer. Sergeant Knutson saw the looks of mounting annoyance on his deputies' faces as he came down the stairs and gestured for them to stop asking the couple questions. Knutson then led Roger and Pam into the kitchen, where it was a little quieter, and he asked them to have a seat at the table. Knudsen then asked one of the deputies to videotape the conversation he was about to have, and then he told Roger and Pam to walk him through what had happened from the top. Knudsen's first impression of the couple was that they did not seem traumatized from their ordeal or even particularly sad that Roger's father had clearly just been murdered. Instead, they just kept glancing at each other and smirking like this was some sort of game. Pam explained that they were planning to spend the evening with Kay and Darla, but when they arrived at their house, they were greeted not by Kay and Darla, but by strangers with guns. Pam said that her husband, Roger, sensed trouble immediately and asked the gunmen if they could just take their pecan pie and leave. But the gunmen said no. And then another gunman said very simply, "You've seen our faces, and so now we have to kill you." Knudsen listened silently to Pam and Roger's story, but inside, he was thinking that it was totally ridiculous. So they were confronted by two men with guns, and their first thought was to try to get their pecan pie back? Shouldn't they have been more worried about Kay's safety or their own? Who would ever think first about saving a pie? But Knudsen let Pam continue. Pam said the gunman made them kneel in the living room, and then one of the men zip-tied their hands in front of them, while the other zip-tied their ankles. Then the two men just left Pam and Roger kneeling on the ground for a really long time, totally by themselves. Pam said while they were kneeling there, she just prayed to a picture of Jesus that Kay had hung in the living room, as much to calm herself as it was to calm her husband. Roger as well had begun praying loudly while they were kneeling there, and he was right in the middle of a sentence about the Lord being his shepherd when Pam started shushing Roger because she heard the gunman coming back. But to Pam's surprise, one of the gunmen told Roger to keep praying. Then both gunmen bowed their heads and silently listened as Roger asked God to spare his wife and him from harm. After Roger said amen, the gunmen said they had decided not to kill Pam and Roger after all. At this point, Knudsen just completely did not believe the couple. Pam and Roger were claiming that the same men who had just slaughtered Kay Mortensen like a hog decided not to kill the only witnesses because they were so moved by Roger's prayer? Are you kidding? But Knudsen didn't realize the story was actually about to get even more ridiculous. Pam and Roger continued and said that the gunmen had told them they would let the couple live on one condition. Pam and Roger should tell police that they were held hostage by 3 African-American men. That way, investigators would not go looking for the 2 young white men who actually committed the crime. One of the gunmen then took Roger's license from his wallet. If the couple told investigators what really happened, he said, they would come to their house and kill them. The couple then said they escaped from their zip ties as soon as they realized the gunmen were really gone, and then Pam immediately dialed 911. She told Knudsen she had to be vague with the 911 operator about the number and race of her attackers because she was trying to tell the lie that they had demanded. But she said Roger, who was kind of yelling in the background during this call, was telling the truth. It really was 2 white men in their early 20s with black hair and maybe a mustache or a goatee. And then Pam told Knudsen that Roger had run upstairs to find his father, bound hand and foot and slumped over the bathtub. Kay had bled profusely from deep wounds in his neck, and his body was cold to the touch. Roger knew immediately that his father had been murdered, and so he went downstairs and told Pam. To Knudsen, Roger just didn't seem that shaken up about his father's death. In fact, Roger seemed a little gleeful. As the video camera rolled, Roger told Knudsen that his father was a, quote, cantankerous old fart, end quote, who never stopped sharing his opinions. He also volunteered that, now that Kay was dead, he was likely to inherit millions of dollars from his father's estate. Sergeant Knudsen thought the whole story was absolute nonsense, except for the part about Roger inheriting millions now that his dad was dead. Knudsen was mildly offended that Pam and Roger would expect him to believe their cover story. This was not his first day on the job, and these two seemed totally guilty. Kay's wife Darla finally reached the police tape across the driveway to her house a little after 9 p.m., feeling totally exhausted from worrying over the past hour. At this point, she was still expecting to hear about something Kay had done to another person, like shoot them or something. But when Darla identified herself to the sheriff's deputy guarding the driveway, he immediately led her and her friend inside to Sergeant Knudsen, who had a grim look on his face. He said he was so sorry, but he had very bad news. Darla's husband was dead. Darla immediately fell against her friend as the world that she and Kay had built dissolved in an instant. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of her stepson Roger just standing in the corner looking beleaguered. Darla ran to him and hugged him tight as she started to weep. The two just stood there in a silent embrace for a long time. Sergeant Knudsen watched Darla as she leaned on Roger, weeping, and he felt a pang of sorrow for her. But he also knew he was leading a murder investigation that just couldn't wait. If Pam and Roger were actually telling the truth, then that meant the gunmen were still at large, posing a huge threat to other people. Knudsen at this point basically did not believe Pam and Roger's story, but he still wanted to give them a chance to fully explain themselves. The stakes were simply too high to do anything else. So, late on the night of the murder, he asked Roger and Pam to come back to the sheriff's office so they could go over everything that happened again, but in a quieter, more peaceful setting. By this point, investigators had done a first sweep of Kay and Darla's home, and they had discovered that about 20 guns in Kay's bomb shelter were now missing. But if the killers were there to rob Kay, why had they only taken 20 guns? Kay had way more guns in the house, some of which were so valuable that Kay kept them in a safe. It made Knudsen wonder if the theft of a small portion of the guns was just a part of Pam and Roger's cover story to try to draw suspicion away from themselves. So Sergeant Knudsen sent Pam and Roger to separate interview rooms so the investigators could compare Pam's answers to Roger's to see if there were any differences. And almost immediately, Pam and Roger's stories began to go in different directions. Roger said the gunmen were wearing, quote, blue fuzzy gloves, end quote. Pam said they were wearing purple surgical gloves. Roger said he freed them both from the zip ties with the knife he was carrying. Pam said she freed herself. Knudsen, sitting across the empty interview table from Pam, finally just stopped asking questions and just stared at her with a mixture of incredulity and irritation. Then Sergeant Knudsen took a deep breath and told Pam point blank, "I think your story is a bunch of crap." And then he asked her flat out if her husband was capable of murder. Specifically, could Roger have killed Kay just to get his inheritance early? Pam replied that she didn't think so, and then quickly added, quote, "I personally would not have had my father-in-law killed for money," end quote. But that's exactly what Knudsen thought was really going on, that they had killed him for money. And later that night, when Sergeant Knudsen showed the videotape of the interviews with Roger and Pam to Kay's wife, Darla, Darla began thinking the same thing. Roger and Pam were clearly acting very suspicious. By the next morning, Knudsen and his team had figured out a few things about the death of Kay Mortensen. The crime scene itself was very neat, with no fingerprints, blood spatters, or signs of a struggle for investigators to analyze. That suggested that the crime was totally planned out ahead of time, but it also suggested something more. Kay may have knew his killers. Here was a man who carried a gun at all times because he was so worried about his personal safety, and he was a black belt in karate, but he apparently let the murderers right into the house without any problem. The investigators also realized that their victim was the kind of person who had rubbed a lot of people the wrong way over the years. Stubborn and quick-tempered, Kay had been through 2 divorces before he met Darla, and he was estranged from one of his sons over a fight about money. Over the years, he had fought with Brigham Young colleagues, a business partner, and of course, the woman who owned the Great Dane that he had shot. At the same time, Kay had close friends going back decades, people like Martin Bond, the other guy who was very into doomsday prepping, as well as Martin's father, Mike, and they both lived nearby in Payson. Kay had helped them both cope with the death of Martin's older brother in 1997. Also, Kay could be very generous, loaning money to friends and family in need without really ever pressing for repayment. And so as a result, Kay had died with lots of people who owed him money. And so investigators came up with this long list of people who had something to gain from Kay's death, from revenge to debt forgiveness. But they struggled to identify anyone who would have been motivated to actually kill him. Roger and Pam suggested a guy named Mike Kipp, who apparently was so broke he had recently sold some of his guns to Kay to raise some money. And it just so happened that those were the very same guns that the gunman took from the bomb shelter. And so maybe, they suggested, Kipp just wanted his guns back. But Roger's own relatives increasingly suspected that Roger may have been involved in his father's death, and they let Knutson's team know that Roger had a history of violence. He had once aimed a gun at a vehicle full of Boy Scouts when he was riding on his ATV, and his third ex-wife had accused him of throwing her against the wall and slapping her. He had also battled a drug addiction in the years after his head injury. Roger admitted to having a troubled past, but he insisted that that was the past before he met Pam and settled down. And he loved his father. They had bonded over their love of guns and often traded weapons. He considered his dad to be his best friend and said that he gave him money anytime he asked for it, and he also helped him break his addiction to drugs, and so why would he want to kill his dad? But when Roger agreed to take a lie detector test, he failed it. The analyst concluded that Roger was trying to be deceptive. Investigators tracked down the suspect that Pam and Roger had suggested, Mike Kipp, to see if he could have conceivably killed Kay to get his guns back. But Kipp told the sheriff's deputies who came to his house that he was not at all angry at Kay. He was grateful that Kay was willing to pay him $25,000 for some 30 weapons, money that he desperately needed. He was distraught over Kay's murder, and he had witnesses who knew Kipp was nowhere near Kay's house on the day Kay was killed. Sergeant Knutson quickly decided that Mike Kipp did not kill Kay Mortensen. Meanwhile, Knutson's deputies were having a hard time confirming key parts of Pam and Roger's story about the home invaders. They couldn't find the mysterious blue hatchback that Pam and Roger said was parked in the driveway, and the two white male suspects were given such a generic description by Pam and Roger that really they could be hundreds of people. Also, Pam and Roger just consistently behaved like they were hiding something throughout the entire investigation, even before they had struggled with the lie detector tests. Knutson and his boss decided it was time to turn up the heat on the couple to see if they would crack. The sheriff's deputies still had no direct evidence that the couple actually harmed Kay or hired others to do it for them, but Knutson just felt like it was a matter of time before they confessed. On February 2nd, 2010, more than 10 weeks after Kay's murder, the sheriff's office announced to the media that Pam and Roger were persons of interest in Kay's murder. Investigators filed a court document laying out the inconsistencies in the couple's statements about the day of the murder and pointing out that Roger had a criminal history that included both violent threats and theft. Roger had been found guilty, but mentally ill, by a jury for stealing tools from the hardware store where he worked. A judge sentenced him to 45 days of home confinement, saying his depression was not an excuse for criminal behavior. The sheriff's office also complained that Pam and Roger had stopped cooperating with the investigation. Basically, investigators had stopped just short of actually saying that Pam and Roger were the murderers. Pam and Roger were now totally isolated. The entire Mortensen clan believed they were the murderers, except for one of Roger's aunts. However, she didn't think they were innocent. She just thought they hired a hitman to carry out the crime. Over the coming months, detectives would pore over every detail of Pam and Roger's life, while county prosecutors convened a secret grand jury to determine whether the evidence was enough to put the couple on trial. Sheriff's deputies also searched their home and cars, finding illegal weapons as well as marijuana. Finally, on July 29, 2010, 8 months after Kay's murder, the grand jury indicted Pam and Roger for murder. Prosecutors said the couple had misled investigators from the very first 911 call, and they never stopped misleading the investigation. Authorities were certain they were the ones who brutally killed Kay and then tried to make it look like a robbery gone bad. On the same day of the indictment, a team of armed sheriff's deputies showed up at Pam and Roger's door, accompanied by TV cameras. When Pam and Roger came to the door, the deputy told them they were under arrest for the murder of Kay Mortensen. They were booked into the Utah County Jail and ordered to be held until they could raise $500,000 bail. That night, 150 miles to the east in the town of Vernal, Utah, a young woman named Rachel Bingham watched the TV news showing Roger and Pam being let out of their home in handcuffs. The reporter said that the two would soon face trial for killing Roger's own father so that he could collect his inheritance earlier. Rachel shuddered as she watched the TV. She had been keeping a secret for months, and it was absolutely destroying her. She knew she needed to come clean to investigators. A couple of days later, on July 31st, Rachel finally got up the courage to call the Utah County Sheriff's Office. She was on the verge of tears as she began talking to the sheriff's deputy on the other end of the line. She told them that she had been withholding vital information about the Mortensen murder since March and had been trying to block the whole tragedy from her mind as the case against Pam and Roger progressed. But when she saw on TV that the couple was about to be tried for murder, Rachel said she just could not remain silent any longer. Rachel explained that she had just divorced her husband, who happened to know a lot about the Mortensen murder. Rachel didn't talk to her ex anymore, but right before their divorce, when they were still trying to work things out last March, he had told her that he really needed her help. Then he let her in on a huge secret. He said he knew who killed Kay Mortensen, and he even had the evidence to prove it. He had the guns that had been stolen from Kay's bomb shelter. But Rachel said her ex-husband feared that the killer was going to find the guns unless he found a new place to hide them, and so this was why he needed Rachel's help. And so, against her better judgment, Rachel had rented a U-Haul truck, and then she and her ex-husband had filled it with those 20 guns that had been stolen from Kay. Then, early on March 31st, the two drove into the desert near Vernal with their young son sitting in between them. Eventually, Rachel's ex directed Rachel into a wilderness park full of cliffs up to 100 feet high. Then the three of them walked down a trail into the woods until Rachel's ex-husband picked a secluded spot and began digging a hole to bury the guns in. After her ex-husband had tamped down the freshly overturned soil with a shovel and covered it with branches, he made Rachel promise not to tell anyone about the weapon stash. Otherwise, her ex-husband said, his life could be in danger. And so Rachel had kept her word until now. The deputy asked Rachel to please come into the sheriff's office for a formal interview. Rachel wiped away her tears and said she would. She had no choice. And so, the next day, Rachel drove to the sheriff's office in Provo, Utah to meet with Detective Knutson and his team, and as soon as she was settled down on a couch in front of the video camera, she began talking. Based on what Rachel told detectives, and also the detectives' follow-up investigation, here's what really happened on November 16th, 2009, the day Kay Mortensen was murdered. At about 5 p.m., the two killers pulled into Kay Mortensen's driveway inside of a blue hatchback vehicle. Their plan was to steal Kay's prized gun collection, but just in case, they were each carrying handguns if Kay gave them any trouble. But their motive was definitely robbery. The ringleader of this duo had serious money problems, and his sidekick could use some cash too. When the killers rang the doorbell, Kay instantly recognized the leader as someone who had been inside of his house many times, and so naturally he invited the pair into the house without any hesitation. The ringleader felt a surge of excitement as soon as they stepped through the door. His plan was actually working. Almost immediately, the killers pulled out their guns and handed Kay zip ties. They told him to bind his own wrists. Kay had seemed both surprised and annoyed to be treated so rudely by a friend, but he did as they asked. He then pointed out that his wife would be home soon, so they didn't have much time for whatever it was they wanted to do. The men said nothing in return and just put on latex gloves to make sure they did not leave behind fingerprints. Once their gloves were on, they told Kay that they wanted to know where to find his gun collection. The ringleader said he knew that Kay had scores of weapons, including very valuable antiques, so where were they? Kay directed the men to the guns in his bomb shelter without telling them about a much larger and much more valuable collection he kept inside of a safe. Even with guns pointed at him, Kay did not want to give up his best weapons. But the killers didn't question Kay, and instead, they took all the guns from the shelter and loaded them into the blue hatchback. But then, the home invasion took a dark turn. After loading all of the guns into the hatchback, the two killers went back inside the house, they grabbed Kay, and began walking him towards the stairs that led to the upstairs bathroom. As they passed through the kitchen, the sidekick happened to grab a butcher's knife. Now, the ringleader had not planned to kill Kay. But for some reason, after the sidekick had grabbed the knife and clearly showed he was going to use it on Kay, the ringleader just kind of went along with it. And so the two killers just walked Kay up the stairs into the bathroom, and they forced him over the side of the bathtub so his torso was kind of hanging in the tub and his legs were out. And then one of the two killers took the knife and began sawing at the front of Kay's neck. And as they did this, Kay began screaming in pain, and then after sawing away at his neck for a while, one of the killers took the knife, raised it high into the air, and then plunged it straight down into the back of Kay's neck. A blow he had seen used before in gladiator movies. Kay's body had barely gone limp when the killers heard the front doorbell ring. The sidekick got down to the door first, and he let Pam and Roger into the house as the leader was coming down the stairs as well. The sidekick then calmly told the couple that they were going to kill them. Roger immediately started crying, but Pam, she stayed cool. The killers zip-tied Pam and Roger's wrists and ankles, and then left them kneeling in the living room for 45 minutes while the killers cleaned up the crime scene. But when they returned, Roger was praying aloud, and the gunman stopped and quietly listened. The ringleader told his accomplice that there could be no more killing today, and the two men agreed to let the couple live as long as they blamed the crime on 3 African-American men. It would turn out Pam and Roger had actually been telling the truth the whole time. Then the two killers drove away from the scene with their stash of guns. They went out into the desert and buried them, figuring they would sell them when publicity about the murder died down. But as the investigation went on for months and months, the ringleader started to worry that his accomplice might turn the weapons into authorities and try to pin the murder on him. That's why he had asked Rachel to rent the U-Haul in March. The ringleader of the crime was Rachel's ex-husband, Martin Bond, whose father happened to be a dear friend of Kay Mortensen. 22-year-old Martin had been to Kay's house from time to time since he was a little boy, and he had bonded with Kay as an adult when they both took an emergency preparedness course together. Bond insisted to his ex-wife that he had only planned to rob Kay, not kill him, and that he had been powerless to stop his 22-year-old accomplice, Benjamin Rettig, from slaughtering Kay. In the end, the partners in crime turned on each other. Rettig claimed the whole crime was Bond's idea. Rettig said Bond had first told him about the robbery plan the day they actually carried it out, and he also insisted that Bond was the one who actually killed Kay. Rettig pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life. As for Bond, he claimed he was innocent, but a jury convicted him and sentenced him to life without parole. He later admitted in jail that he had been the one who slashed Kay's throat, but he said he only did it because his partner, Rettig, had a gun aimed at him. As for Pam and Roger, they were released from jail on December 7, 2010, after 4 months of incarceration, and the prosecutor's office said the couple was fully exonerated. The couple sued the Utah County Sheriff's Department and prosecutors for falsely accusing them of murder. However, the lawsuit was tossed out because the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that no one can sue over inaccurate testimony made to a grand jury. On an afternoon in January of 2012, 56-year-old Jane Beshara and her husband Bob were standing in the front yard of their large 5-bedroom, 2-story home in Grosse Pointe Park, a wealthy suburb of Detroit, Michigan. Jane was tall, with short light brown hair, and she was wearing jeans, a sweater, and a black nylon jacket. The temperature was barely above 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but for people who had grown up in Michigan, like Jane and Bob, it didn't really feel that cold. And it wasn't snowing that day, so Jane thought it would be the perfect time to show Bob where she wanted to make some updates to the house and to the yard. So, the two of them walked around outside and talked about how they could make their home even more beautiful than it already was. Bob, or Big Bob, as he was known by most of their friends, was a huge 6'4" tall guy with broad shoulders and dark hair. And he made his living in real estate and property management, so he enjoyed figuring out ways to update houses and increase their worth, especially when it was his own personal home. Bob had grown up wealthy, but he'd always wanted to add to the money he'd inherited from his family. So he had started his own business, and now he collected rent on multiple properties in the area, including houses, apartments, and buildings with bars and restaurants inside of them. But it was Bob's height, not his money, that had first attracted Jane to him when they met at a party all the way back in 1983. Jane didn't think looks were the most important trait in a man, but she was tall, and she liked tall guys, so when she had seen Bob towering over everybody else around him, he caught her eye. But once Jane and Bob had started talking that night at the party and spending time together afterwards, their attraction went far beyond physical appearance. They discovered they had a lot in common. Jane and Bob were both devoutly religious. Jane volunteered at her church, and Bob served as a deacon in his congregation. And once they had started dating, they enjoyed going to church services together. And they were also both really driven. Bob had worked very hard to start and grow his business, and even at a young age, Jane had made her way up the corporate ladder to land a high-paying marketing position. But the biggest thing that had drawn them together when they were young was that they had both wanted to start a family. And so, after dating for about 2 years, Jane and Bob had gotten married, and not long after that, they had 2 kids, a son and then a daughter. And then Jane and Bob, along with their 2 kids, had moved into their dream home in Grosse Pointe Park. But now, both of their kids were out of the house. Their son had moved away for work, and their daughter had recently gone off to college. And so Jane and Bob were now adjusting to their new lives as empty nesters. And so they tried to find other things to focus on. They worked hard running charity fundraisers in the community, they spent more time with their friends, and they decided to do work on the house that they never had a chance to do when their kids were younger. As the couple walked around their property looking for things they wanted to fix, Bob said he knew someone who could get started very soon on some of these updates they wanted to make. Bob said the guy's name was Joseph Gentz, and that he used him often as a handyman and yard guy at some of the properties that he managed. Jane said that would be great, but the truth was, she had actually met Joseph when he'd done some small repairs around the house, and she didn't really like him that much. Joseph was as big as Bob was, but not nearly as calm or soft-spoken. And Jane knew that Joseph had intellectual disabilities that sometimes made it difficult for him to communicate clearly. And when he got frustrated, Jane had seen that he would lash out, and it was kind of frightening. But Bob believed helping Joseph and making sure he had steady work and income was the right thing to do. And Jane couldn't argue with that because she believed people should do whatever they could to help those who were less fortunate than they were. So Jane smiled at Bob and said she was excited about the work they were going to get done on the house. Then she headed inside to get ready for a wine night she was hosting at the house for some of her friends. Later that night, Jane opened the front door for the first of her guests, and when she did, she looked out and she could see all the lights from the houses across the street shining on the perfectly manicured lawns and luxury cars parked outside. And so even though her kids were no longer living there with them anymore, which made Jane feel a little bit sad, Jane still felt like Grosse Pointe Park was the perfect place to live. But there was another side, a hidden side, to the Detroit suburbs that seemed like a completely different world from Jane and Bob's quiet neighborhood. And on a night in January, not long after Jane had her friends over, a person who was known online as, quote, Master, arrived at an event space that was part of that other hidden side of the suburbs. Master wrapped their arm around their partner's waist and then walked into a party filled with members of the local BDSM community. BDSM stands for bondage, domination, submission, and sadomasochism, and so the BDSM community was a group that practiced varying degrees of bondage, domination, submission, and sadomasochism, often in a sexual setting. Master was well known in the BDSM community because they hosted small gatherings of their own at a nearby dungeon, a 2-room basement outfitted with a bed, whips, ropes, and other materials common to the BDSM scene. So, at the January party, Master and their partner made their way around the venue, said hello to the people they knew, and introduced themselves to people they hadn't met before. Loud music was playing and partygoers danced, drank, and talked. Some of the guests were dressed casually, almost like they'd come straight from work, but some were wearing head-to-toe leather, and others wore dog collars attached to leashes around their necks. And everybody, no matter what they were wearing, looked relaxed and like they were having a great time. Some people on the outside, who were aware of the BDSM community, thought this group was strange at best and dangerous at worst. But the truth was, most of the people at the party that night had healthy relationships, successful careers, and loving families. This was just one aspect of their lives that they had entered into happily and consensually. But Master was something different, and some members of the community, including some people at this party, wanted nothing to do with them. These people saw Master as someone who used the cover of BDSM to act out on their unchecked violent tendencies, and it would turn out those people were right. As Master walked through that party, they were totally preoccupied with violent thoughts. Because Master and their partner had big plans for the future. They wanted to invite a third person into their relationship who would live with them full-time in a brand new house they were going to buy. But Master knew doing something like that wasn't going to be easy. It would take work and a ton of money. And so, Master had recently decided that to achieve their goals for the future, they would have to kill someone. And they had already chosen a target. It was a person who lived a relatively quiet life in a beautiful home in a wealthy suburb. At about 4:45 p.m. on January 24th, 2012, a couple of weeks after that BDSM party had taken place, Jane drove down the street through her neighborhood in her black Mercedes-Benz SUV. And as she drove, she was smiling and chatting on the phone with her daughter. Then Jane pulled into her driveway and hit the garage door opener. She told her daughter she would call her back in a little while once she'd gotten settled and changed out of her work clothes. Then she told her daughter she loved her, said goodbye, and hung up the phone. Jane pulled the Mercedes into the garage and then closed the garage door behind her and then glanced at the clock on the dashboard. She knew Bob wouldn't be home for a few hours because he was meeting a potential client for a drink, so she figured she'd relax for a little while, maybe have something to eat, and then call her daughter back. Then Jane turned off the engine, stepped out of her car, but right away she heard something behind her. Jane turned around and immediately froze. Someone was in the garage with her. Jane shouted at them, and the person lunged at her and shoved her against the car door. But Jane pushed back and stumbled forward. She was confused and terrified, and she thought she was being robbed. Then the person in the garage grabbed Jane from behind, raised up their fist, and slammed it into the back of Jane's head. Jane fell forward and hit the ground hard. Her head was pounding, but she tried to pull herself up. But before Jane could move, she felt a sharp pain in her neck and throat, and she struggled to breathe, and then everything went black. A few hours later, Bob pulled into the driveway and opened the garage door, and the garage was empty. Bob parked his car, went inside the house, and walked across the first floor to the living room. He sat down on the couch and turned on the TV. Then he gave his wife a call, but Jane didn't answer, so he left a message letting her know he was home and that he was just checking in to see where she was and when she would be home. And then Bob hung up and watched some more TV. But after a couple of hours went by with no word from Jane, Bob started to worry, so he called her again, but she still didn't answer. So Bob called a few of Jane's friends to see if she was with them or if maybe they had seen her, but they told him that no, she was not with them and they didn't know where she was. And so starting to panic, Bob started calling family members. And when he heard that Jane had told their daughter she was going to call her back but never did, Bob became very worried. So at around 11 p.m., 6 hours after Jane had pulled into her garage and been attacked by that stranger, Bob called 911 to report his wife was missing. But it had only been a few hours since someone had spoken to Jane, and Jane was an adult, so it was way too early to actually file a missing persons report. However, the officer told Bob that they would try to locate Jane to make sure everything was okay. And so Bob gave them Jane's description, along with Jane's phone number, and the make, model, and license plate number of Jane's car. But hours later, Bob still hadn't heard anything, so he called the police again. And they told him they still had not been able to find Jane, she wasn't picking up her phone, and they had not found her SUV. The police told Bob to stay calm, and they told him they would let him know if they learned anything new. But when Bob hung up, he couldn't calm down, and he ended up staying awake most of the night waiting to hear something. But by the time the sun rose on January 25th, Grosse Pointe Park police still had no idea where Jane Bashara was. On the morning of January 25th, about 9 hours after Bob had first called the police, a tow truck driver was cruising the streets in an old neighborhood in East Detroit. Over the years, this neighborhood had become a popular spot in the city for drug dealers to do business, and it was seen as a hub for heroin users in Detroit. Because of that, a lot of the houses in this area had been abandoned, and people also often abandoned cars in this part of the city. And that's why the tow truck driver had made it a point to drive through the neighborhood every once in a while. So the driver scanned the streets from his truck, looking for cars he might be able to tow, but nothing really jumped out at him. But then he turned onto a side street and he drove past an alley, and when he did, he slammed on his brakes. He looked out his window into the alley and was shocked at what he saw: a beautiful black Mercedes-Benz SUV. The tow truck driver was used to finding cars stranded in the area, but he never saw cars that cost as much money as the one he was looking at. So the tow truck driver pulled his truck into the alley and parked close behind the SUV. Then he grabbed a pad of paper and a pen, and he wrote down the license plate number. Then the tow truck driver called his boss and told him about this car, he gave him the license plate number, and then he asked if he could go ahead and tow the vehicle. But the tow truck driver was shocked when his boss abruptly shouted at him to stay right where he was and not do anything. The tow truck driver asked what was going on, and his boss said the cops were looking for that car, so he just needed to stay there and not touch the car. The driver said he understood and hung up. And then, minutes later, the tow truck driver heard police sirens blaring through the neighborhood, and soon his truck was blocked in the alley by multiple police cars. The tow truck driver tried to stay calm as a police officer with the Detroit Police Department approached the tow truck. The driver knew he had not done anything wrong, but he'd also never had police swarm around a car he was trying to tow. So the driver got out of his truck, he answered some basic questions from the cop, and said he'd been cruising around when he saw this car, and he made it clear that he had not done anything other than take down the license plate number and call it in to his boss. The police officer thanked the tow truck driver and then walked down the alley towards the Mercedes. Then the police officer leaned in close to the back window on the passenger side, and he shielded his eyes with his hands to cut down on the glare. And when he got a clear view of the back seat of this car, he immediately yelled out for the other police officers to come over and take a look. And soon after, they got the car door open and stared at the back seat in disbelief. There on the back seat was a badly bruised and beaten dead body. But the body looked like it had been posed. The victim was on their knees with their face down on the seat, and a black nylon jacket had been put on the body backwards, so it looked like the victim was wearing a straitjacket. Once the officers got over the initial shock of what they had found, they proceeded to search the entire car. And during this search, they found an open purse lying on the front passenger seat floorboard. The contents of the purse had spilled out, and they quickly found a checkbook, credit cards, and a driver's license. The victim in the back seat was Jane Bashara. Not long after her discovery, homicide detective Donald Olson of the Detroit Police parked his car near the alley and stepped outside. The cold weather, like most things, didn't really affect Olson. He had been a detective for a long time, and so he'd seen his share of horrible violence and strange cases all across Detroit. So, as he approached the officers who had first arrived on the scene, he didn't really expect to see or hear anything that would rattle him. But when Olson looked into the backseat of the Mercedes and saw Jane's body in that pose, he admitted he was shocked by it. And it wasn't just because of the pose Jane had been found in. Detective Olson just couldn't understand how a wealthy, middle-aged woman from Grosse Pointe Park had ended up dead in a neighborhood in East Detroit that was known for drug deals and heroin use. Soon after Olson's arrival, the alley was blocked off with crime scene tape and filled with police. Olson's initial take was that Jane's death had not been a part of a robbery because her credit cards and checkbook were left behind in clear view inside of her car. But Olson wanted to wait for more information before he started forming any theories. And so, as forensics experts took blood samples and fingerprints from Jane's car and her body, Olson stepped away and called the Grosse Pointe Park Police. And that police department was about as different from the Detroit police as possible. While Detroit cops had dealt with close to 400 reported homicide cases during the previous year, Grosse Pointe Park hadn't had a single reported homicide in about a decade. So when Olson called to tell them that Detroit police had found a murder victim who was a Grosse Pointe Park resident, the officer on the other line was stunned. Then Olson said they needed to inform the victim's husband, Bob Bashara, and Olson said he would drive out to Grosse Pointe Park to accompany the officer delivering the news to Bob's house. Olson knew the small suburban police department would not have dealt with a case like this before, so he wanted to be there when Jane's husband was given the news. Because Olson knew the first place to start with a homicide like this was almost always with the spouse, even if it was just to rule them out. So Olson got in his car and drove from the neighborhood in East Detroit where Jane had been found to Grosse Pointe Park. The drive only took him about 20 minutes, but as Olson looked out at the huge homes and the fancy cars lining the streets, he felt like he might as well have traveled to a different planet. At around 10:45 a.m., almost 2 hours after Jane's body had been discovered, Detective Olson and an officer from the Grosse Pointe Park Police walked up to Bob and Jane's front door. But before they could even ring the bell, the door swung open and Bob stepped outside. His hair was a mess and his eyes were bloodshot, and the first thing he said to them was he had been waiting all night to hear anything from the police, so what's going on? But then Bob noticed the looks on Olson and the other officer's face, and immediately he just dropped his head and slumped over. Olson gently asked if they could come inside to talk, and Bob nodded. Then Bob turned around and slowly led them through the entryway into the dining room, where they all sat down at a long dining room table. Then Olson looked at Bob and in a quiet voice said Detroit police had located his wife's car and they had found her body inside. And even though Bob was obviously shaken up, his reaction to this was to immediately start recounting all the events of the previous day, telling Detective Olson where his wife had been and where he had been. Olson thought this was a strange, somewhat defensive reaction, but he knew from experience, people reacted very strangely to horrible news like this. And when Bob finally slowed down and stopped talking, Olson just said he was very sorry for his loss and that he did not want to impose right now. But he asked if Bob would be willing to stop by the Grosse Pointe Park Police Department the following day to answer some questions. Bob said he would definitely do that and that he was willing to do anything they wanted to help them figure out what happened to his wife. Olson and the other officer told Bob again how sorry they were, and they thanked him for taking a few minutes to talk to them, and then the officers walked out of the house and headed for their car. And once the police were gone, Bob was forced to call his kids and his family to tell them the horrible news. And as Bob made these very difficult calls, word began to spread through Grosse Pointe Park that Jane had been found dead in the backseat of her car in East Detroit, and it sent the town into a sort of shock. People couldn't believe that this had happened to someone who had been so well liked in such a vital part of their community. And a lot of people who heard the news and who talked to Bob made it clear they wanted to come together right away to do something to honor Jane. And so that evening, Bob stepped out of his house and took part in a huge candlelight vigil right in his front yard to honor his wife. And that night, scenes from this candlelight vigil made it onto the news, and Detective Olson realized by seeing the images just how much of an impact Jane's death had had on her entire community. And so he hoped he would be able to bring the case to a quick close so they could all start to heal. On the same night as this candlelight vigil, so January 25th, which was the same day that Jane was found in East Detroit, the person known online as Master grabbed their phone and called their partner. Master told their partner to come over to their house so they could discuss the big plans they had been making for the future, bringing a third person into their relationship and buying a new home together. But their partner seemed upset and distant, and for a minute, Master started to worry. They were sure they had never mentioned their thoughts about killing someone to their partner, but now they wondered if somehow they had slipped up, and if their partner suspected that they had something to do with the murder that was now all over the news. And so Master asked their partner one more time to come by the house, but their partner flatly refused and hung up the phone not long after. And so Master just sat there in silence for a moment, trying not to panic, because all that was going through their mind was, if my own partner thinks I might have killed someone, isn't it just a matter of time before the police think the same thing? The following morning, so on January 26th, one day after Jane's body had been discovered, Bob followed an officer through the Grosse Pointe Park police station to a small interrogation room. Bob walked across the brightly lit room with stark white walls, greeted Detective Olson and the other officer he'd seen at his house the day before, and then took a seat at a small table that was pressed up against the wall. Olson sat down next to Bob and thanked him for coming in. Then Olson asked Bob if he had been able to think of anything that might help them, or if he knew of anyone who might have had a grudge against Jane. But Bob said he couldn't think of anything because none of this made any sense to him. He said Jane was well loved in town, at her job, at their church, and as far as he knew, she had never even driven to that part of Detroit where she was found. And so Bob just kept saying over and over again that really none of this made any sense. Olson said he understood, but then he leaned across the small table and looked Bob dead in the eye, and then Olson said he knew every marriage had its problems and that husbands and wives often kept secrets from each other. And Olson said he wondered if maybe there was something going on in Jane's life that Bob might not have known about. But Bob just started to look confused, and he told Olson that he and his wife had been together long enough that they basically told each other everything that was on their minds. And if there was something he didn't know about her, it would have been something really little that had no bearing on anything. But then Bob stopped himself mid-sentence and he started shaking his head. So Olson leaned in even closer and asked Bob if he'd just remembered something. Bob looked up at Olson and then looked back down at the floor. Then he said he didn't want to talk badly about his wife, especially now that she was gone. But Olson said if he had information that could help the investigation, he needed to tell them. And so Bob nodded, took a breath, and looked back up at Olson. Then he said Jane did have a secret that she didn't keep from him, but that she did keep from almost everybody else. He said Jane smoked marijuana. At the time, marijuana was illegal in Michigan, so Bob knew Jane would have to meet with a dealer to get her supply. But Bob said he never pressed Jane about where she went or who she got her drugs from. Detective Olson immediately thought to himself there had to be a bunch of different places a wealthy suburban woman could score some weed from before she ever had to go to East Detroit to get it, but he didn't want to rule anything out. And for all he knew, maybe Jane did have other secrets she was hiding from her husband or from other people around her. So, after asking Bob a few more follow-up questions, Detective Olson thanked Bob for coming in to talk to them again, and then he also asked if Bob would be willing to submit to a DNA test, and Bob said of course. And so, while another officer prepped Bob for his DNA test, Olson headed out of the police station in Grosse Pointe Park and made his way back to Detroit. And now he planned to look into the possibility that Jane had been in East Detroit buying drugs. But before Olson could pursue this new potential lead, he got some news that would change the entire investigation. Based on evidence found in and around Jane's car, along with cell phone tracking data, the forensics team came to believe that Jane had not been killed in East Detroit. Instead, they thought the murder had taken place in Grosse Pointe Park, and then Jane's car and body had been driven to East Detroit and then abandoned there. And so that theory led a forensics team to do a sweep of Bob and Jane's garage, and that forensics team discovered blood spatter on the ground, and that blood turned out to be Jane's. And so all of a sudden, this was no longer a Detroit homicide case. And while Detective Olson and Detroit police would still be on hand to assist, the bulk of the investigation would now come down to the small Grosse Pointe Park Police Department. At about 4:30 a.m. on January 31st, 6 days after Jane's body had been discovered, an officer was working the late shift at the front desk in the Grosse Pointe Park police station. The investigation into Jane's murder had been in full swing for days, but things had been relatively quiet while investigators waited on more test results from Bob and Jane's garage. Then, suddenly, the officer at the front desk heard the station door open. He looked up and he saw this huge, hulking man walking towards him, acting kind of erratic. The man wore a suit, and he kept pulling at the jacket sleeves as he walked. Then the man stepped right up to the officer, said his name was Joseph Gentz, and that he was the man who killed Jane Bashara. At first, the officer just stared at Joseph. There were no detectives at the station that early in the morning, and he really didn't know how to handle something like this. But he pulled himself together and asked Joseph to give him his full name again. Joseph told him who he was and that he had worked as a handyman for Jane's husband, Bob. The officer still wasn't sure exactly what to do, so he led Joseph to one of the few holding cells they had at the station. He locked Joseph inside of it, and then he went back to the front desk and made some calls. And that morning, Detective Mike Narduzzi of the Grosse Pointe Park Police woke up to the sound of his phone ringing. And at first, he couldn't understand what he was hearing. So he asked the officer on the other line to slow down and tell him clearly what was going on. And when Narduzzi heard there was a man at the station confessing to Jane's murder, he shook himself awake and got dressed as fast as he could. Narduzzi had taken over the case when it moved out of Detroit, and he was already feeling totally overwhelmed. He'd only been a detective for about 3 years, and he had never handled a homicide. But as he sped down the road in his car towards the station, he told himself that a confession could be everything he had hoped for, and it could allow him and his team to close this case way faster than they expected. A few minutes later, Narduzzi arrived at the station, and he headed right to the interrogation room where Bob had been questioned a few days earlier. He walked into the room, and he saw Joseph already sitting at the small table. And Narduzzi stopped and just stared for a second. Even sitting down, Joseph looked enormous. But Narduzzi put on a smile, introduced himself to Joseph, and then sat down at the table with him. Then Narduzzi asked Joseph to explain what he knew about Jane's murder. And Joseph told Narduzzi that he had done a bunch of work for Bob at his different properties, and so that's how he knew the Bisharas. And then Joseph started explaining how he had killed Jane step by step. But then suddenly, Joseph stood up and started unbuttoning his dress shirt. Narduzzi asked him to sit down, but Joseph lifted up his shirt and showed scratches on his chest and stomach, and he said that was where Jane had fought back. Then Joseph started pacing around the small room and saying something about money, and Narduzzi kept trying to get Joseph to sit down and stay calm because he couldn't figure out exactly what Joseph was even talking about. Finally, Joseph stopped pacing, and he leaned down, looked at Narduzzi, and said there was way more to this story and that there was actually a conspiracy behind Jane's murder. But when Narduzzi asked for more clarification, Joseph just couldn't really explain what he was saying. And by the end of this meeting, Detective Narduzzi was exhausted and confused. It was clear to him that Joseph had some intellectual disabilities and that it was difficult for him to tell a clear story. But Narduzzi wondered if Joseph really was just having trouble explaining it, or if maybe he was making this up. And so the Grosse Pointe Park Police ended up holding Joseph in a cell overnight, and then they questioned him again the following day. And this time, Joseph was clearer about what had taken place on the day of Jane's murder. But by the end of that session, Narduzzi still had a lot of questions, and so he didn't think they had enough proof to charge Joseph with Jane's murder, but he did think they could get that proof down the line if they could follow up on some of the things Joseph had been talking about. So Joseph was released from police custody and told not to leave town, and the investigative team went to work trying to corroborate Joseph's story. And in early March, a little over a month after Joseph's confession, police arrested him and charged him with murder. The news of Joseph's arrest spread quickly, and it at least provided some comfort to Jane's family and friends. And the Grosse Pointe Park community was happy that justice had been served and that their town felt safe again. But in reality, this case wasn't actually closed, and it would prove to be way more bizarre than anyone had realized. Because in the months following Joseph's confession, the Grosse Pointe Park Police would receive 2 phone calls that would send investigators back into the field. And what they learned from those calls would eventually lead them to the BDSM community, and into the world of the person who called themselves Master. Based on the phone calls police received following Joseph's confession, evidence found in Jane's car and in her garage, cell phone data, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Jane Bishara on the day she was killed, January 24th, 2012. At 4:45 p.m., Jane's killer crouched in the corner of Jane's dark garage. They wore black pants, a black leather motorcycle jacket, and thick-soled black boots. The killer had gone over their plan, but they were still nervous, and they could feel their hands shaking. Then suddenly, the garage door began to open, and the overhead light went on, and the killer immediately pulled themselves as close to the wall as possible so they wouldn't be seen. Then the killer watched as Jane's Mercedes SUV pulled into the garage, and they could see Jane talking on the phone in her car. The killer took a deep breath and waited. Jane hung up the phone, turned off the engine, grabbed her purse from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the car. But the killer didn't move because they weren't sure if they could go through with this. But then Jane turned around and she saw the killer and started shouting, and the killer panicked. So the killer stood up to their full huge height, they lunged out of the corner, grabbed Jane, and shoved her into the driver's side door. But Jane scratched as hard as she could at the killer's chest and managed to step away from the car, but then the killer grabbed her from behind and slammed their fist into the back of her head. Jane's purse dropped from her hand and she fell to the ground face first, and then she began pleading for help and trying to pull herself to safety. But the killer immediately dropped down to the ground right on top of Jane's back, and they wrapped their huge hands around her throat. Jane choked and struggled to breathe, and her feet started kicking wildly, and the killer could hear her shouting. Finally, the killer released their grip, and Jane's head hit the ground, and she lay there wheezing, trying to compose herself. Then the killer stood back up, raised their boot, and placed it on the back of Jane's neck, and stomped. The killer heard a loud crack, and then afterward, they slowly backed away from Jane's now dead body. The killer wanted to run, but then they heard a voice from the other corner of the garage, and the person who called themselves Master stepped into the light. And together, Master and the killer picked up Jane's body and put her in the backseat of the car on her knees. Then Master took off Jane's jacket and put it on her backwards, so she looked like she was bound in a straitjacket. Master grabbed Jane's purse and dumped out the contents on the passenger floorboard. Then they told the killer to drive to East Detroit and leave Jane's car there with her body inside. The killer nodded, got into the car, backed out of the garage, and sped off. And when the Mercedes was out of sight, Master, aka Bob Bashara, Jane's husband, closed the garage door. Then, Bob went into the house, changed his clothes, and headed out to drink at a bar that was housed in one of the properties he owned. It would turn out Joseph Gentz, Bob's handyman, really was Jane's killer, but Joseph had been working for Bob the whole time. The revelation of Bob's involvement in the murder would take police months to unravel, because this case led them down paths they just hadn't seen coming. And with each new piece of evidence, the case just seemed to get even stranger. Bob, aka Master, who was well known in the BDSM scene, had been planning to buy a new house for him and his partner, a woman he'd been having an affair with for years. And they were both eager to welcome a third person into their relationship who would live with them in this new house. But in order to make that happen, Bob would have to get rid of his wife Jane. And he couldn't just divorce her, because it turned out that Bob's personal wealth had taken a huge hit over the past few years, and his real estate business was failing. But if Jane was dead, Bob could collect money from her life insurance policy and her substantial 401k retirement fund, and he could drain their joint bank accounts and sell their house. And all that money would enable him to support himself and the two women he hoped to start a new life with. Joseph Gentz had brought up Bob's involvement in Jane's murder during his confession, and he had said Bob had paid him to kill Jane. But Joseph changed his story about Bob's role in the murder multiple times, so police didn't feel like they had enough evidence to initially charge Bob. But then, the woman Bob had been having an affair with reached out to police, because it turned out Bob had lied to her for years and said he and Jane were divorced, and it wasn't until she saw clips of the candlelight vigil on the news that she realized Bob had still been married, and she started to suspect that he had murdered Jane. And so she pulled away from Bob and told police they had been having an affair for years and that they were planning on buying this house together soon, but she didn't say anything to police about her and Bob's involvement in the BDSM community. But soon after that, police received the two phone calls that cracked the case wide open. The first was from a woman in Oregon who said Bob had found her on a BDSM site, and Bob had wanted her to be the woman to join him and his girlfriend as the third live-in member of their relationship. But when this woman had refused to move to Michigan and said she didn't want anything to do with Bob, he started to harass and stalk her online, and so when she read about Jane's murder and saw who Jane's husband was, she called the Grosse Pointe Park police to say Bob was potentially dangerous and could very easily have killed his wife. This led police to finding more information about Bob's life in the BDSM community, and they found others in that community who also believed Bob was capable of real violence. And then, as police started to close in on Bob, they got the second of the two important phone calls. This call was from a local furniture salesman who knew Bob, and this man said Bob had contacted him and offered him thousands of dollars to kill Joseph Gentz before Joseph could testify against Bob in court. And soon after they got that call, investigators convinced the furniture salesman to wear a wire so they could get proof of Bob offering to pay money for a hit on Joseph. The furniture salesman agreed, and Bob immediately fell into the trap, being caught on tape offering money to have Joseph murdered. And so, in late June of 2012, 5 months after Jane's murder, police finally had enough evidence to arrest and charge Bob for killing his wife. Joseph Gentz, the killer, was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 17 to 28 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 2029. Bob Bashara was convicted of murder as well and sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2020 at the age of 62. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballin, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not available on this podcast. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next